Hello and welcome to another episode of our show. We have with us today Dr. Claudia Gold. Claudia is a pediatrician, infant parent, mental health specialist, author, teacher, speaker. She's the author of books, The Developmental Science of Early Childhood, The Silenced Child, Keeping Your Child in Mind, and The Power of Discord. Just wonderful work that you've been doing. I was doing a little bit of research. You've also started this Hello, It's Me project, which really seems to be attachment focused with parents and their infant children and getting them used to their role. Because for a lot of us, I mean, there's so many aphorisms about parenting, like children don't come with instruction manuals and all of these sayings. And really, you can read as many books as you like, but when you meet your child for the first time, it's awe-inspiring, but it's also terrifying. I remember when I met my daughter for the first time, Sophia, I was like, oh my goodness, this is my duty. This is my responsibility and my privilege. So thank you so much for being here. What actually originally brought me to you, Claudia, was the writings of Elizabeth Young Brule, who wrote the book Childism. I wrote this book when I took a philosophy of children course many years ago, and I was one of the only other males in the room, which was quite intimidating.
Yeah.
And I wish it weren't that way, to be honest, but
yeah.
'Tis his life. Anyways, what can you tell us about childism?
Okay. So Elizabeth Young Brule was a historian, psychoanalyst, a brilliant woman who sadly died suddenly of a pulmonary embolism right before the book came out. So it kind of robbed the world of the opportunity to discuss her ideas. So it's prejudice against children. And she sees it as rooted in this idea that that people see children as needing to be controlled rather than understood. And a lot of the book is actually about the history of the child protection concept in the United States. So I also do a lot of work with families with substance use. So I have a lot of interface with child protection. And when it was originally set up, it was, as she describes, it was thought to be a child saving organization or institution rather than a family promoting. So it would be very much punitive of parents. So that was this kind of approach of child. In order to protect a child, you had to protect them from their terrible parents. And so that childism is rooted in that as well. So instead, the way what we would do better in supporting children is to think about parents as really always meaning to do their best for their child. So rather than protecting children by punishing their parents, would be to have a society that supports healthy parent-child relationships by supporting parents. And how sort of paradoxically, we do exactly the opposite of that in our country in terms of government-sponsored support of families. So people who, this gets to be a little bit political, but people who sort of promote themselves as pro-family are actually, most in the name of freedom, depriving families of the kind of support that they need in order to really listen to their children and support healthy development, in contrast to other countries that have very extensive support networks for children and parents. That's a very long answer, but I hope I got it all in.
No, that was awesome. I myself am a child counselor, an elementary school counselor, and it's an amazing privilege because my job is to listen to children, to listen to young people. And the things that they tell me are, the whole gamut of emotions. But I think there is this idea of what a child is, and then there's the reality. And I think what we wrestle with is that our ideals of what a child is are just so far from what it really means to be the experience of what it is as a child in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what is it that we wrestle with? What are the ideals of the child, and what are the realities that you're seeing in your work?
Well, I think I just wrote a piece about the importance of shared intentionality in our being human. So kids come into the world, they already have, as you know, being a dad, a baby comes into the world, they're already so much of a person, their own little person, their own little unique person. And they have so much capacity to communicate that. Whether it's that they like to snuggle, or they prefer to kind of see the world on their own terms, or whether they feel very calm in a room that has a lot going on, or whether they get easily overwhelmed and disorganized, they can communicate that about themselves. And when parents have what one of my big influences, Winnicott's called a holding environment, when there's a culture that supports parents so that parents can really be there to listen to their child's communications right from the beginning, then they have kind of a natural intuition, and there's this kind of give and take where the parent and the child get to know each other in a very natural way. But if you have, a world where there's an expectation of immediate return to pre-pregnancy functioning, where parents are often alone and partners need to go back to work right away, or worse, that they're alone in a pandemic trying to work and take care of their children, or experiencing, incredible stress, substance use, domestic violence. If other things are going on that really pull the parent away from that ability to be fully present with their child, then right from the start, this kind of natural, what I call in my most recent book, mismatch and repair, gets off track, and it kind of can derail development. So we really need, if we really want to support children, we need to support parents from the very beginning to be able to be present with their child in the way that they need.
How are we failing to support parents?
Well, in some very basic ways, which is that paid parental leave. Like, we are one of the only developed countries that has no system of paid parental leave, and even or minimal paid parental leave. So that's one thing that really needs attention. Childcare is another thing, that if we want, if both parents want to work, investing in quality childcare, affordable childcare, is really critical. But then, so those are sort of broad government policy. But then there are things like, in some communities around the world, there's an expectation that the community feeds the mother. There's an expectation. I mean, I think fathers are so neglected, that there's an expectation that the father goes immediately back to work. Some places there is some paternity leave. I don't know if you were able to have that, but it's certainly not the typical expectation. So we don't really have a culture of postpartum care that recognizes the need for parents to be there to just take care of their child, to have somebody who brings them food or does the cooking, or, really takes care of the mother and the father. We don't have that kind of an expectation in our culture.
And is that's sort of a product of the industrialized sort of working.
Yeah, and I mean, some countries do a lot better at it. I have a colleague who is from, I work with a lot of people who are from Australia or in Great Britain where they have health visitors. So at least that there's an expectation that somebody comes into the home, every person. So there's no stigma and comes in regularly to see how the mom is doing, to weigh the baby. We don't have anything like that here. So there are other societies that are industrialized who do a better job than we do. But then there are also, non-Western communities where in communities in Africa where many different people within the family all raise the babies, and it's really a much stronger community support than what we have in Western culture.
And I mean, many people may say, well, what's coming to my mind is that there's individualistic cultures and there's collectivist cultures.
Yeah.
And perhaps this is a struggle that we have in our individualistic culture, is that we don't have the supports that we need.
Right.
Which actually kind of brings to mind how a teacher, one of the most brilliant teachers that I've ever known, Christy Svensson, she's teaching grade 2 during the pandemic. And while many of us have just been absolutely exhausted, she said that it was one of the best years that she said it was the best year she ever had as a teacher because of how close she became with her students.
Really?
Wow, that is such an encouraging thing to hear.
That's amazing.
Yeah, she's an amazing teacher.
How did she do it?
I think that there was a mentality of that we're all in this together.
Uh-huh.
And it's through that, the roots of attachment. She really embraced that model of, we are a unit, we're going to figure this out. And the kids, the students, they became more resilient. And she's always been someone who is at their level. And I think that that's a really good model for teaching, for parenting, that again parallels what young Brule was saying with childism, is that we were all once children, but yet we forget. I've met people who they're like, I don't like children. And I'm like, what? How could you not like children? They're this is my own bias, of course. They're the greatest thing there is, right? We learn so much about ourselves from being around children.
Yeah.
Right. And so what? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, and when you really listen carefully, even as I said, starting from birth, but toddlers, they have a tremendous ability to communicate what's going on for them. You just, if you're paying attention and you kind of know what to look for. I in my practice, I should say, where I tend to see people who are struggling, it never ceases to amaze me where if we just kind of, we don't get into what to do or how to solve the problem, but we just play around and it's messy. And that's what I wonder about your teacher, whether she let it be kind of messy. And then we get to what is really going on. And the child inevitably is able to tell you what's going on, even if it's not in language, it's in their play or their behavior. I agree with you. Obviously, we're like-minded in that way, that we think children are quite extraordinary. I wonder about your teacher friend also, facing it like this is a problem and we've got to figure this out together, that there was this kind of collaboration, it sounds like, between her and her students, as opposed to kind of trying to smooth it over and make it be like normal school. And I think that's a major message of our most recent book, The Power of Discord, that when you acknowledge that things are really difficult and messy and kind of go through it rather than smooth it over, you can have what it sounds like she had, these tremendous growth in relationships. Like, we got through this together and look where we are now. And that's exactly where, like you said, resilience comes from.
Well, I think too that I could be a bit of a philosopher, and the name of the show is I'm probably wrong about everything. So correct me at any point. I won't, yeah, there's no hill too high I won't die, or, I'm not afraid to die on the hill. But people have talked about white supremacist culture, and there's this idea of perfectionism in it. And I think that myself as a parent and being in this world and and living in it the way that I have, is that one thing I have wrestled with is perfectionism. And I think that that's one thing that I'm seeing in parents, is that there's this idea that we have to get it all right, that we have to know it
Oh
all,
yeah.
but we don't know it all. And the more that we can say, like, hey, I am really not sure about
Yeah.
this,
No,
kids learn from
absolutely.
that.
No, I think I'll answer. There's a lot in that question. So let me speak to the perfectionist part of it, which I'm more comfortable with. Um, yeah, I think certainly there is an expectation of perfection that goes along with a lot of aspects of our world, and certainly with parenting. And one of the major themes in my most recent book, actually in all of my writing, is this idea of the good enough mother. And what that really means is the not that it's okay if you make mistakes, but that you need to make mistakes. Because like taking, for example, your colleague and her class, I'm sure, everybody was kind of fumbling around for a while because it's such a strange environment, and there are going to be mistakes, and we're going to, not know how to teach things, and we're going to misunderstand each other. And it's through the mistakes and the imperfections,
Right,
that people really grow and learn. And this is true in parent-child relationships and really in all of our relationships. I have to say, I have never heard the idea that white supremacist culture and perfectionism go hand in hand like that. And I have to give myself a little bit of time to think about that. So
of course, yeah.
I'm curious about that.
Well, and what that's saying is, we oftentimes think about white supremacists as this very explicit sort of form of oppression or power,
Yeah.
but what it's saying is that, it's white Eurocentric dominant culture, is that
Right.
that's what's sort of
Okay.
making
Yeah.
the composition of what everything is. And through
Yeah.
that, some of the tenets are perfectionism,
Okay.
being right or wrong versus understanding. It's,
Yeah. Oh, so
dialogue.
those are, yes, I get that exactly. So those are kind of traditionally, uh, yeah, in that more holistic view of white supremacy. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And how other cultures, as you've mentioned, they've the way that they have the parent-child connection is different. It's not so much about control, but it's about guiding, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a myriad different ways of how communities raise their young. But I
Right.
think that when we can sit back and realize, the more that we can bring in from others, the better. That, like, I think that multiculturalism is so is so much of the answer in moving forward as a
Yes.
society.
Yes, I agree. Yes. Because I think, we've had a lot of uh, emphasis on what I like to think of as cultural humility, rather than cultural competence, because cultural humility is really about listening. And it's kind of a universal concept that, that even if you and I are both white, your experience versus my experience, or I'm Jewish, and if I were to speak with another Jewish person, I wouldn't automatically know what their experience of being Jewish was like mine. And, so each individual person has their own uh, experience, whatever culture they're in. And so really understand, if I interact with somebody who's Black, or somebody we have a large immigrant Latino population where I work, I want to hear, what is their story? Who are you? And rather than some sort of probably unattainable competence at you as a more of a, of a group.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of overlap between these concepts of cultural humility and listening.
Well, I mean, that's really, that's one of my theses of my work, is that the
Mm.
more that we can kind of listen, the further that we'll get ahead. Of course, we can't have two people that are just listening, because then nothing's really being said, right? But in turn taking, and which
Yeah.
is why the power of discord, I was like, whoa, this is so important. Is that another thing about the sort of idea of the Eurocentric dominant culture or white supremacist culture is that we got to avoid conflict. Instead, we kind of go to be passive aggressive. But through conflict, we can actually, if we have the humility to be wrong, and just kind of like, oh man, like I messed that up. Like, let's be respectful here. Let's move forward. Like you mentioned previously, let's move through this rather than avoid it. That's where the understanding comes in. And
Exactly.
and that's the reconciliation, right? Which is so much of what we need right now. And I've heard it said that the basis of so much conflict, one of the primary reasons for conflict, is misunderstanding.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say certainty. We are plagued by this sense of certainty.
Yes.
And that's another big component of listening. Like, I don't really know. I don't get it. Can you explain it to me? I mean, I can't, unless I don't quite get your experience and I say it wrong and maybe I get you upset. And then I ask you why, what did I do? And you explain to me, that's how we understand each other rather than, I know, like, how you feel or something like that, which is a more kind of distancing, off-putting kind of expression.
Right. Well, yes. And this idea of we are more similar than we are dissimilar, but always, like you say, using that in my experiences, I have similar experiences, but they're not the same,
Right.
and then moving from there. You mentioned certainty, and we've talked about, the emphasis on getting it right. Where do you think that comes from? And I'll tell you my own answer. I think it comes from parenting, our form of parenting.
Yes. It comes from sort of a also Eurocentric kind of not only, this is not across the board for sure, but authoritarian models of parenting tend to lead to difficulty with sort of flexibility and openness to other people's points of view. So I think some of the polarization and certainty we see is related to authoritarian parenting, which in turn is related to our lack of support of parents, because it's hard to be a flexible, open, curious parent when you're alone and exhausted and having to turn to substances to get through your day, or you yourself are not taken care of. So authoritarian kind of parenting may become the default kind of parenting, or even this would sort of lead us back to Elizabeth Young Brule, even more sort of what people would, might bleed into more neglectful or abusive kind of parenting by parents who themselves are not supported and held. And I think, some of the roots of our, the discontent in our world today begin with that.
Right. Well, and you're talking about substances, and I always get this name wrong, or I think I do. I'm not confident in this name, but Gabor Mate, he talked about trauma, multi-generational trauma, and how that feeds into addiction, because really addiction is just it's self-medication. But we have such another thing about our culture, another idiosyncrasy of Eurocentric culture is the usage of shame.
Yes.
And because we feel shameful, we self-medicate with the substances.
Yeah.
So how do we get away from that? How do we break the cycle as parents?
Well, I'm just thinking in my mind of a story I just very recently heard. I find it easier to answer these questions if I talk about actual story. And I disguise all the stories I use in my work are, tweaked so that not to violate confidentiality. But so a child who was in the foster care system growing up, so had a lot of early trauma, and then became pregnant as a teen, and now has her own child who's she's now struggling with substance use, and her child is not in the foster care system, but is in the care of her mother. So here we have this kind of punitive child protection system. You're a bad mom. You didn't do this. You have to follow all these instructions. We're going to give you this list of things to do. But saying, what is your relationship with your mother? And can we find a way for you and your mother to reconnect with each other so that you can get your mother back and then you can be a mother to your child? So if we had a system of child protective services and mental health services that saw the value of supporting relationships rather than shaming people and punishing people, then we might be able to. In fact, when I was on this meeting, I said, do you think there's any possible space for repair now? Because here you have the grandmother, the mother, and the child who's now like 4. And so much hurt and so much trauma. And if we could work with the 4-year-old and the mother and the grandmother in a way that really listened to them and acknowledged their generations of trauma, then there would be opportunity for repair. But that's really the only way, not to send people to punish people and to have that kind of shaming, institutional shaming that child protection often, even though there's some very good, well-meaning, well-intentioned people within the system, as a whole, it doesn't have a flavor of listening. It has a flavor more of punishment and shaming.
Well, I work in British Columbia in Canada, and the Ministry of Child and Family Development, it is only in very extreme circumstances that they remove children from their families. The goal is to empower families. At least that's what they always tell me on paper.
Oh, okay. So I didn't realize we weren't in the same country when we. Oh, okay. So I'm talking.
But there are parallels. Oh no. But there's parallels, right? I mean,
but we have our set of problems compared to Canada.
but Canada is, no perfect. Of course, no perfect system exists, but how you get closer is through collaboration. Because children, do children really know boundaries and borders and nationalities and things like that? These are all kind of constructs, right? You're a Canadian, you're an American. Kids are just kids, right? Whatever that expression means, which is lovely, right? So what do children need from parents? It's a loaded question. And
well, I have to say, I would start by saying, well, what do parents need? Because as soon as you start saying, well, what do children need from
that's the childism.
If I were a parent, I'd be like, well, I would become immediately. I am a parent, but my kids are in their 20s. I would feel anxious. I would feel like the person who was speaking was going to blame me for something. So I think what children need is for their parents to be held by their culture. Number one. Then once that's done, then they need this is my first book, Keeping Your Child in Mind. They need their caregivers to be curious about the meaning of their behavior rather than necessarily simply controlling their behavior. They need empathy. They need not necessarily like if you want the green sippy cup and you can't have it and you have a meltdown, that's the end of the world, but that there's empathy for the child's experience, even if it's different from the parents. But they also really need boundaries and limits. And I think this is a common misconception that listening to children means just letting them run the show. But children, the way they develop a sense of their own self and their own ability to manage their big emotions, their ability to pay attention, their ability to manage their impulses, all those things that are important for socialization and learning, A lot of that is in boundaries and limits. So those are really, I would say, the three core things that children need: curiosity, empathy, and limits.
I'm writing that down. That's a great answer. Yes. Well, the other sort of observation that I'm seeing is that so many parents, I mean, they're just working all the time and they don't have time to be in their kids' lives. So they spoil them, like they give them whatever they want,
Mm-hmm.
but what they want isn't what they need. And what they need, as you're saying, is these attachments, or what I'm hearing you're saying is these powerful attachments where they know, like, I understand that you're upset,
Mm-hmm.
but these are your choices, right?
Right. Right.
So what would you say children are struggling with most in the 21st century? Just based on, the power of discord and why we need conflict. So why do we need to really look at, this is a two-part question.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we need to understand that our kids are experiencing conflicts? And what is it that you're seeing is a lot of the conflicts that they're facing?
Well, I think if we, kids are struggling with what I just described, managing themselves. So you might see the ability to have big feelings and not lose control, the ability to be socially flexible, the ability to be flexible, not only socially, but in your thinking, like all of those things that we consider mental health. Those all emerge through the moment-to-moment interactions with a child, with their primary caregivers early in life. So that's where this thing we call self-regulation comes from. It comes from co-regulation in these messy moment-to-moment interactions, or with not only with the mother or only with the father, but many different people in a child's life. And those form the child's core ability to manage themselves in the world. And if that beginning was not strong, or there wasn't space for that typical mismatch and repair for a variety of reasons. I mean, one is simply, as I said, a parent who's overwhelmed with many young children and exhausted. The other is, a loss or a trauma, like you alluded to. Sometimes there are factors in the child that make the process difficult, like a child who has neurologic vulnerability, sensory processing sensitivities. So if for a whole range of reasons that sort of natural, intuitive mismatch and repair doesn't happen early in life, then children will struggle with self-regulation. They'll struggle with their attention. They'll struggle with managing big emotions. They may struggle being close to other people. So I think we are seeing a lot of that. And it certainly it's escalated and exponentially grown because of the effects of the pandemic, when people were deprived of that rich environment of social give and take. And so we need that. So that, but I think the good news is, so that's where children are struggling, when the developmental roots were not strong. But the good news is that what we learn from child development is that these things can change, over your entire lifespan. But they don't change just by, 6 weeks of CBT. Yeah. They change by immersing yourself in a whole network of relationships where there is room for that mismatch and repair. So whether it's with teachers, whether it's with Taekwondo instructors, whether it's through doing photography or having a puppy, or, all the different ways we can be in the world in relationships that allow us to, if we haven't had a solid sense of self from the beginning, to grow that kind of sense of self. Even into your 80s and 90s, you can change in that way.
And that's that neuroplasticity, is that
Right.
who we are is, we don't have to always be that way. And I tell
Right.
kids all the time when I work with them, I'm like, yes, my grandfather would tell me, you make a mistake once, that's what it is. It's a mistake. It happens again. It's a habit. But the good news is that habits stop being habits the moment you choose that other thing. So if, say, you always get into a fit of rage and you punch holes in walls, which is something that I struggled with as a young person, that moment when you become so enraged, but then you take a deep breath and then you calm yourself down, your brain is rewiring and creating a new neural pathway that,
Exactly.
oh, I have a choice here. I don't have to just go that way.
Exactly. And I'm curious how you did that, because typically it's something that happens over, hundreds of thousands of those moments where you take a breath. It's not like just once you learn that, oh yeah, okay, now I'm never going to punch another hole in the wall. But over time, your body, it's not only your neurons. I mean, it's not only your brain, I should say. It's your whole body learns a different way of being in the world over time. Which it sounds like that's what you did, and that's when people are struggling, whether they're 9 months old or 6 years old or 25 years old or even 80 years old. That's what I think about, like immersion in interactions that can help you to manage your brain and your body in a healthy way.
And just in the work that I do, I try to avoid shoulds. Like, this is what you should do.
Mm.
But I do bring up, these are things that you should avoid, right? Or these are shouldn'ts, perhaps. And
Okay.
one of them is, for example, yelling at your child. I
Mm-hmm.
really don't think that that's an effective strategy. Like, unless it's like it's a life or death situation, like your
Right.
child's about to run onto the street. Hey, what are you doing? Right? And they're like, whoa. But like, what are you doing? Like, why do you keep making these mistakes? I just think that crushes the confidence of children. Now, my bias here is that may or may not have been what I experienced as a young person. So that's where I get that from. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you believe in shouldn'ts or shoulds,
Oh,
and if so, what are they?
yeah, no, you're absolutely right that yelling, punitive kind of parenting is never effective.
Right.
And the only caveat I would say is that we all yell at our kids at
Yes.
some point.
Yeah.
It's just that you say, wow, this is where you need to, like, I need to take care of myself because this isn't good for my kid or me. So then maybe you do lose your cool and you yell at your child. And then you say,
Mm-hmm.
I had a really tough day, or I was upset with daddy, or whatever. And I'm sorry that I yelled at you. And that can become a moment of growth. But when you as a parent find yourself yelling at your child all the time, things are not going well, and you need some support in some way to get yourself be able to be better regulated.
Right. What sort of, because a lot of the books that I read, they can be quite abstract, which is wonderful, and it's like, oh, okay, I get it. But then when the rubber hits the pavement or whatever, it's like, oh man, I don't have any skills, right? I know these things as like kids need attachments and things like that. But what are some good practical strategies for
Mhm.
parents to be more perhaps mindful or to develop mindfulness?
Well, one of the big influences on my work is Bruce Perry, and he teaches in the program where I'm on the faculty. And he's just written this book with Oprah Winfrey. So he has this upside down triangle where it's regulate, relate, reason. So to recognize that when you're in a tough moment, what we often do if our child is upset or we're upset is we try to explain it. Well, like I work with a child who has a lot of trouble with personal space. Like she can't stand someone near her, so she pushes them. And then the teacher says, you you can't do that. And then the teacher's talking at her and the teacher is standing close to her. And so she's getting more and more agitated. And so she pushes the teacher, and then the teacher gets agitated, and the teacher then keeps trying to explain to her what she needs to do, or ask her, why are you doing that? Can you tell? And the kid has no idea. The kid is like in that regulate, like not even in the relate part. So you've got to start with the regulate, both for the adult and the child, which means breathing. The very first thing you need to do is to breathe. And, that's where these things like square breathing or different kinds of breathing techniques can be very useful. Or whatever it is, like some people walking, like even just going for a 10-minute walk. I sometimes have kids go, parents go with their kid, just walk up and down the block, because the movement of your body will begin to regulate your physiology.
Right.
So then once you're regulated, then you can be in relation to another person. And only after that do you get to reason. And I think we go right to reason.
Yes.
And then everybody just falls apart. So that would be, it's not really exactly a tip, because it's not like you should do X, Y, Z, but it's just more of a frame to think of that regulate, relate, reason motto.
And the other thing is, the work that I do, I work with some very complex cases. And one thing I always tell kids is that I say, hey, you made a bad choice. You made a poor choice, but you're not a bad person. And it's almost like I'm telling a kid what I in my strategies, I try to put myself in their shoes, because I know I had some, my own adverse experiences in life.
Yes.
And I say, hey, you made a bad choice, but you're not a bad person. And I try to give them unconditional self-regard, right?
Yes.
Like, no matter what happens, I always will like you.
Yes.
And to me, that's what I think kids need to hear, is that parents, yes, they love their kids, but that it's good to also be interested in them.
Yes.
And I think that that's a good strategy, is because kids oftentimes, and I think this is sort of the premise of the book, Hold On to Your Kids, by Gabor Mate and Gordon Neufeld, is rather than try to resist what your kids are into, take interest in it. So if they like heavy metal, instead of being like, turn that awful music down, just be like, hey, that's really cool. And it transforms it from being extrinsic pursuits of identity, like I'm doing this because, I'm getting something out of it, to intrinsic pursuits of identity, right? Like I'm doing this because I'm understanding myself. And I think that as parents, if we can take interest in our children, that it stops their behaviors from it being defiance, right? Because it's like, hey, that's really cool that you want to see this movie, or let's unpack that, versus making it like, don't see that film. It's almost like, I love the movie Lion King. Mufasa, one of the greatest father figures in all films, but he made a grave error when he said to his son, don't go to that shadowy place over there. Well, what does Simba want to do? He wants to go immediately to that shadowy place, the elephant graveyard, right? What if he just told him, this is what it is? And I think that sometimes while we go to straight to reason, we also sometimes miss it too. We don't tell kids why. Why can't I do that? Because I said so.
Right. So underestimating their ability to understand. I mean, this, we're talking about for older children. Yeah, absolutely. Being respectful, I think, is part of what you're saying.
And the other thing is, with mental health, things like anxiety, depression that children are experiencing, is that on the rise, or are we just seeing it more clearly now?
I think it's definitely on the rise. I would say with anxiety is an interesting word, because anxiety is an experience and it's also a diagnosed mental illness.
Right.
well, it's also true of depression. Like, I think people are getting overwhelmed by feelings that they then can't manage, which is, rather than saying at point A, you're healthy, and at point B, you have an illness, which is kind of not the way mental health works. Although things like the DSM, where you go through a diagnostic criteria, and at the time, this time you have this. That's not really how our mental health works. So at some point, your ability to deal with sad feelings, or your ability to deal with anxiety becomes, you become unable to manage it, and that is usually rooted in relationships. So I think that circles back to the other thing you were asking me about. What are kids struggling with now? We're struggling with having a paucity of those kind of rich relationships that help us to be ourselves and to have big feelings without falling apart. And so the result of that is then what we call depression and anxiety. So it's just a slight reframing of it, because my worry is that in the medical model of disease, if we just say, oh, all these kids have depression and anxiety, and then we just give them, CBT or medication, we're not really getting at what is depression and anxiety, and how it really, to address depression and anxiety, you need to really be immersed in relationships in a developmental way over time. So mental health tends to not have a particularly developmental or relational frame, which I think can be a problem. So a lot of the writing that I do is really placing mental health questions, issues. I like to use the term emotional struggles, emotional suffering. Like, we all have emotional suffering. That's kind of the human condition. And that understanding and addressing emotional suffering needs to happen in a developmental and relational context. And that does not in any way mean to stigmatize it. This is just something that people have, and that need support and healing.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great point, that we will all experience emotional struggles. And perhaps sometimes what the problem is that when we experience this emotional struggle, it's not taken seriously. Like, a dog dies and that's your first loss, and someone says, get over it. Like, whoa, talk about a shouldn't. And then the person kind of buries that down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate you bringing up, because all of this, I think grief and protecting time for grieving and mourning is such an important part of listening. And so often I find that when people are struggling, as I take time to listen in my office, I uncover loss that was never addressed or mourned. And so a lot of the process of healing is about grieving.
Yeah. And perhaps that's something that most people, across the gamut of culture, that why do we struggle with grief? Because it's hard, right? We love to distract ourselves. I'll speak for myself. I love to distract myself. But then when you sit with yourself and you experience those feelings, healing is not easy, right? Yeah. And is there any way to make it easier or more successful? Is there any way to make healing easier? Yeah.
Well, I think it's time and lots of opportunity for moving through the grief. It's not just like over in 6 months or a year. It's a lifelong process. And also in my office, I found that the tissues were like my most important instrument, and I had to have them on the table, because the worst thing is when someone starts to cry and you give them a box of tissues.
Yes.
But somehow that they were there. And so, and often when in a very natural way, a person would cry, that there is this, it's very painful, but then you get through it. And that's where you start to heal. So I think that whatever crying represents, which I don't really know exactly the physiology, but that process of really being in the grief is so important for healing, and to be in a way that you feel safe and that you are not alone.
Yeah. I mean, when people cry around me, it's just like, that again is such a privilege of this person obviously trusts me and they feel safe.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's a sacred moment.
It is.
When you're with somebody and they're, you know, I had a student tell me that he was having, they were having these behavioral problems. And he told me that, you know, his brother died, or sibling died before he ever met them. And he had never told anybody about this.
Oh my gosh. Oh, that gives me chills. Yeah. Right. And imagine
he'd never told he'd never met him. And he told me that, oh, my parents, they say I remind me so much of this person. And it's like, what? And here to me, this is like a routine traffic stop, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, there's that privilege of, and I do think that going back to childism is that one way that perhaps maybe I am effective at this is because I'm just a big kid, right? And I think that kids identify with that. We talk about video games and, you know, I don't say, oh, that's so bad for your eyes. I say, tell me more. And kids really do love it when they share what they're interested about, because so often I think kids experience the talking down to thing, and that's all for good reason, of course. But when it's like, tell me more about you, and you're having that back and forth, that active listening, that level playing field, you see something, not to sound corny, but it's magical. It really is.
Yes. No, I agree with you. It is magical. Yeah.
So now, with another thing that I work a lot with and I experience a lot with is the rise of suicidality amongst children. And it seems like it's getting younger and younger.
Yeah.
And, you know, and again, it's like, if I say, oh, just wait till you're older, there's so much to look out for. I don't think that that's of any use.
No.
So again, going back to that level to level, how can you help a student, a young person, who's experiencing suicidality,
Okay, so I'm going to just take note of the fact that we don't have a lot of time, and that's a very big question. So I'm going to offer a very kind of global, general answer. You know, what I was talking about this kind of moving through mismatch and repair, where things go wrong and then they're okay. When you have that over and over again, you get kind of a core sense of hope. But when, for whatever reason, you've missed out on that kind of opportunity to see that you can be in a bad spot and get to the other side, that leads to hopelessness. And I think suicidality is sort of the ultimate form of hopelessness. It's a kind of forever is now. Like, you can only see where you are right now. And so whatever it is an immersion in, and I've talked about how, like, having one modality of treatment is usually insufficient. You know, when a person has gotten to that state of hopelessness, a kind of holding in many different opportunities. So whether it's enrolling in I've mentioned this a number of times, martial arts, psychotherapy, art, whatever a child excels in their body, all of those things need to happen together to begin to give a child a sense that even though I feel bad now, I will not always feel bad. Because that's when kids are at real risk, is when they cannot see beyond the immediacy of now.
Yeah, I try to bring in almost like Buddhism has really helped
Yeah.
me in my
Yeah.
life, and this
It is.
idea that
There is a lot of that. Yeah.
all things shall pass, good, bad, otherwise, even though we attribute these values to them. But I think that is powerful. And this eclecticism, it's not just one way of doing things. There's many ways. So last question, because I know that there's time running out, but why did you decide to get into this noble field? And you can hear my daughter in the background, so I'm going to mute myself.
How old is she?
22 months. Or
Ooh,
yeah,
how
22
fun.
months.
Oh my goodness. So, well, my mother is a child psychologist and she saw kids in our home. And I originally wanted to be a child psychologist, but I did an elective when I was in high school, actually, with a child psychoanalyst, and I became absolutely intrigued by child development. So, just like we said, I mean, it's just such a magically wonderful, amazing thing. So I thought, well, I'll be a pediatrician because I'll be immersed in child development. And so I got very good training in pediatrics, and I was working in a very busy practice, going to deliveries in the middle of the night, really very much immersed in families' lives, the way I wanted to be. But as a pediatrician in my training, I had not really learned what I needed to know.
Right.
And so I had to go elsewhere. And so I educated myself first, becoming a scholar with the Berkshire Psychoanalytic Institute, discovering people like Winnicott, who I mentioned earlier. And then I did a fellowship and then was invited to join the faculty of the University of Massachusetts Boston Infant Parent Mental Health Program, where that's where, knowledge tends to be siloed. And I was there, opened up to a whole world of research and knowledge that pediatricians are generally not exposed to. And that that really enriched my world. But actually, I left one piece of it out, which is probably the main motivation why I switched into this way of working, is that I saw so many kids, exponential rise in kids being diagnosed with ADHD, younger and younger and younger, and then bipolar disorder, 15-month-olds. And then I would listen to their stories, and I would hear stories of, things that really got derailed very early on in life. And so I began to listen while I was learning new ways of understanding development. I began to listen to families in different ways, and that just blew my mind. And that was led to my first book, and I've learned more and more, which has been such a privilege to learn from the families I work with and from world leaders of how to really think about how best to promote healthy development of children and families.
I mean, nail on the head right there. We sometimes we see things as, just that, but there's a system beneath it, above it, and so forth. And that's why family systems is so important. I mean, as a counselor, I work a lot with the families, and I think that's a nuanced approach sometimes, because if you do want to see change, when you integrate everybody, then they see that change happening. Well,
and
Claudia,
I'm going to say one more thing, which is talking to you, which is that when there are two parents involved with a child, I always work with both parents, because I think you just don't, the co-parenting piece of child development is so central. And that's also something we often miss in our society. So I appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you.
We'll have to have you on again, Claudia. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.